Continuing with the subject of turbine bearings, in the previous video we talked a little about the types of hydrodynamic and hydrostatic bearings. And I said that I would focus on the bearings most used in turbomachinery, the hydrodynamic bearings, and that's what I'm going to do now. Hydrodynamic bearings are currently the bearings used in most turbomachinery, as they have several desirable characteristics for application in turbines, such as high reliability and good dynamic rotor damping characteristics. Without going into too much technical detail at this point, but if we're going to talk about hydrodynamic bearings, we need to at least know what hydrodynamics is and its operating concept. Let's go. Also known as fluid dynamics, hydrodynamics is a subfield of hydraulics that studies the motion properties of fluids, which include liquids and gases. Hydrodynamics considers concepts such as force, velocity and acceleration, which are variables that act on liquids in motion. Hydrodynamic calculations take into account the properties of the fluid, pressure, density and temperature. That said, I'm not going to complicate things here. In practice, what you need and want to know about hydrodynamic bearings and turbomachinery is their practical operating principle. And that's exactly what I'm going to try to explain to you now. Imagine a rotor resting on a bearing. He thought, wait a minute, I'll help you. Okay. Did it get better? Here we are seeing a bearing, an axle, a vertical load acting on the axle, where the center of application of this load is represented by this X, and the representation of the oil, represented by this darker part. Imagine this all at rest within a closed system, such as a turbine bearing housing. In this first case, there is direct contact between the rotor and bearing surfaces. Do you agree that everything is at rest? These conditions remain until the exact moment of turbine startup. At that moment the conditions change a little, generating now this new situation. Note that now we add a rotation on the axis for the anti-clockwise direction. Of course, it could be the opposite too, depending on the direction of rotation of the turbine. The principle does not change anything. In this case, there will also still be direct contact between the bearing and the shaft. Did you notice that the axis changed its position a little, right? Because this happens at the exact moment the turbine starts. This is a little complicated to explain, but let's try to understand it better. In simple terms, bearing lubrication is characterized by the presence of a thin film of pressurized oil between the shaft and the bearing surface. But contrary to what most people think, this oil film, also known as a compression film, is not generated by oil pressure alone. Although minimal oil pressure is required, the compression film is actually generated and maintained by the actual rotation of the shaft within the bearing. But in practice, bearing lubrication can occur in a few stages, defined by the ratio between the oil compression film thickness and the roughness of the bearing and shaft surfaces. In engineering, each state of lubrication is called a lubrication regime. I'll show you this quickly in a rough but understandable way. It works something like this. Imagine at first that these blank spaces represent an oil film between two surfaces. In our case, the dark parts represent the bearing and shaft surfaces. These peaks and valleys represent, on a larger scale, the surface roughness of these pieces. The compression film arises exactly when the two lubricated surfaces move towards each other, generating a positive pressure. Therefore, they support a load. Some use the term oil climbing. This is because the viscosity of the oil between these surfaces cannot be squeezed or compressed instantaneously when the two surfaces move towards each other, and this action provides a damping effect on the bearings. During this lubrication stage, there is constant contact between the surfaces of the shaft with the bearing. Logically, this is undesirable, but cannot be completely avoided, since it occurs during turbine startups and shutdowns, and also during high loads at low rotations. This phase is called the lubrication boundary. After this stage, we have the so-called mixed lubrication, which is the intermediate or transition stage to hydrodynamic lubrication. Here there is intermittent contact, that is, there is still contact between the bearing and shaft surfaces to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the rotor speed and load, but the oil film is already starting to become effective. After this stage, we finally reached our goal, which is the hydrodynamic lubrication stage. Here, there is no longer direct contact between the surfaces, as the rotation of the shaft and bearing drags the lubricating oil compression film around them, keeping the shaft and bearing surfaces apart. Although this phase is stable, the oil film thickness is not uniform around the shaft circumference during turbine rotation. In practice, if no load is applied to the bearing operating in the hydrodynamic lubrication regime, the shaft will rotate at the geometric center of the bearing. However, when a load is applied to the rotor, for example, unbalance or even steam stresses on the vanes, the shaft moves out of the concentric position, yet no direct metal-to-metal contact occurs at any point during the shaft's rotational motion. In practice, direct metal-to-metal contact is prevented by oil pressure and hydrodynamic forces, which combine to neutralize external charge variance. The position of the shaft within the bearing at any point during rotation is always at the point where oil pressure, hydrodynamic forces and external loads are in balance. So, during the rotation of the rotor, a movement is generated which is a kind of very powerful oil pumping. And all that I've talked about now, from the start up to the typical operating conditions of a steam turbine, are represented by this other configuration. As the shaft rotates, oil is forced into the region below the shaft due to hydrodynamic forces generated by the rotational motion. This generates high pressure at the bottom of the shaft. This high pressure supports the weight of the rotor by lifting the shaft, preventing the shaft from touching the bearing surface. In this image, these vectors represent the oil pressure distribution profile on the axle, giving meaning and intensity. The larger the vector, the greater the hydraulic pressure. Did you understand the principle of the thing? The principle of hydrodynamic lubrication, from a turbine at rest, starting, to operation. So now we can continue talking more about bearings, more specifically about types of bearings for turbines. Are you ready? So in the next video I'm waiting for you to continue this story in our saga of unveiling turbomachines.
Deixa like, comentário, abraço e até o próximo vídeo. Fui!